When we first started looking and doing our constitution in Huu-ay-aht, I was doing some work in the north with the Northwest Tribal Treaty Groups and with Satsan in the regional chief's office, and we were talking about governance then, and we were talking about constitutions in my own community. So we had invited Dr. Cornell to, I think it was a Northwest Tribal Treaty presentation, to start talking about the results of the Harvard Project. And I was so compelled by what Dr. Cornell had presented to us there, and I quickly became what I self-term as a Harvard Project junkie. It was so relevant to take that material and to get to know Stephen in the course of doing that. The stories that have been gathered through the Harvard Project are so fascinating, and they're so real. And what we found in our community, that those are stories that our people get. When we talk to them in those terms about our constitution having to match our culture, about the need to have jurisdictions and authorities and all those things that the Harvard Project talked about, our people understood that. We didn't need to spend a whole lot of time explaining, and it really was an excellent foundation for us to start talking about our constitution over a 7-year process. So as I say, I was thrilled to have met Stephen and to have had him numerous times on the other end of the phone, helping me to think through some concepts and helping our community to work through that process of developing our constitution. So I really have always appreciated the work that Stephen does. Sophie was saying yesterday that, you know, how Indigenous he is in his thinking, and it's so true. I tell Stephen that what I really enjoy is that he's a storyteller. In all of our communities, we have people who tell the stories, and Stephen and his crew, his co-chair Joseph Colt and some of his other team members have gathered the stories from across Canada and across the United States of successful Native nations and what has made them successful in terms of their governance and their economic development. And the ability to tell those stories and share those stories with all of us when you come into our communities is really valuable, Stephen. So I can't say much more than that. I feel so much more than that, but I just really want to welcome you and say how glad we are that you've come to share some of those perspectives with us today. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Stephen Cornell.
Well, thank you, Angela. Sometimes wonder how in the world did I get this gig. It's been the most interesting thing I've ever done in my life. And at a very personal level, far and away the most rewarding. And that's partly because of the welcome that I've received from many of you, from all of you here in these 2 days, but over the last 25, 30 years of my professional career, the welcome I've had from Indigenous peoples has been a highlight of that. And I thank you for that. I also thank the Coast Salish people for hosting this and for the privilege of being on your land. I've been a little uncertain of whether or not what I've got to say today is actually going to be that useful to you, and I've grown more and more uncertain over the last 2 days about it, because when it comes to multi-community governance, I actually think this is the epicenter of it. You're doing it. Listening yesterday to those presentations, listening this morning to the presentations, instead of me coming to tell you international perspectives, maybe you should be going out internationally and telling other people the perspective of the Indigenous people of British Columbia, because you are wrestling with these issues, and I think you're in many ways further along wrestling with them than a lot of other people are. And it's partly because of the distinctive history of British Columbia and the lack of treaties and the fact that you're confronted now as you reclaim a position of power in your lives, in the collective life of your people. You're now in a position where you have to address these issues. It's not a matter of choice. It's confronting you. It's sitting right there. It's on the plate in front of you, and you have to decide what to do. And so you're, in a sense, being forced and choosing to move down a road that where you may be the ones who are really coming up with the solutions. So that said, I think I'm going to share some stories with you from other parts of the world, and some of them may have some wrinkles in them that are valuable to you. I'm not going to get into much technical detail. There's plenty of technical detail in most of these stories, and I think a lot of the people whose stories I'm privileged to know and be able to summarize, would happily share with you the detail of what they've done. I said yesterday that you may not be fully aware of the degree to which you are part of an indigenous renaissance that is happening not only in North America but in other places as well. It's not happening everywhere. There are plenty of places in the world where indigenous peoples are not even recognized as distinct peoples, much less as holding rights or having land, title of any kind. But certainly in a set of countries today, we are seeing a common renaissance happening in the reassertion of indigenous power and of indigenous control over lands, communities, lives, futures. And if there's one aspect of it that strikes me, it's that indigenous claim to the freedom to be yourselves again. Because that's what's been denied by colonialism. You're not allowed to be you. You have to be this product of someone else's idea of what your future should look like. So you're reclaiming the right to be yourselves, and that involves language, ceremony, culture, power, decision-making power, relationships with the land, relationships of every kind. Well, it's happening in the 4 countries that I've paid most attention to in my career, which are the United States, Canada, Australia, and New Zealand. They're known as the Kansas countries, which for a while I thought referred to a state in the middle of the United States. But no, it's Canada, Australia, New Zealand, the United States, the Kansas countries, they call them. And these 4 countries share a lot. They are largely English settler societies, that is, an influx of immigrants over centuries, predominantly, in most cases, English in their origin. They carry English political and legal heritages. In all 4 countries, indigenous peoples were displaced by violence, by disease, with catastrophic results. In all 4 countries, some indigenous peoples have survived. They're still here. And in all 4 countries, they are now engaged in a massive effort to reclaim their place on the land and to reclaim their right to govern themselves. I've also done a little bit of work in a few other places, and I'm going to mention at least one case from Central America where I think we're seeing some issues very similar to ones you're dealing with beginning to emerge. So let's just think for a moment about how we got here to where we are today. You know the story much better than I do. In the countries that we're talking about, we had this horrendous colonial impact, and a couple of aspects of that impact on indigenous peoples. We've already mentioned catastrophic socioeconomic results and other things. But one of the things they did was they disrupted the boundaries, if you will, of indigenous peoples. They challenged your sense of where the boundary lies between you and someone else, between your people and another people. And they disrupted those, in some countries by simply removing people from the land and forcing them into incarceration centers, into service centers, mixing them up. In Australia, we had a massive mixing of people as the Australian government forced indigenous peoples off their country and into service centers, all for the benefit of indigenous people so that we can provide them with social services, which are too expensive to provide in all these little communities out in the boondocks. And in the process, of course, what that did was upset all these collective structures that said, we know who we are as a people and we have ways of doing things. We fragmented peoples, you all know that better than anyone else, I think, because it happened a great deal here. I remember years ago Satsan saying to me, at Wet'suwet'en, they shredded us. Took us a people and broke them up into individual First Nations. And then not only does those boundaries, those collective identities get disrupted, but then the result gets rigidified. No, you're not the Wet'suwet'en Nation, you're 4 First Nations and you're each an administrative unit. Why? Because that's convenient for us, the colonizer. And this is all about what's convenient for us. So you get this process of the disruption of identity and of these boundaries, and then the rigidification of the result, the solidification of the result in structures called here First Nations. Or in the United States, we got some of that fragmentation that happened here, but we also got a lot of peoples being forced together. So you have the 14 tribes and bands of the Yakama Nation in Washington State, 14 different peoples told, no, you all signed one treaty, 1855, you're now one people, you have to operate as one people, and by the way, we're going to treat you as one people. The Confederated Salish and Kootenai tribes of the Flathead Reservation, 3 nations, 2 of them, I'm told, traditional enemies, basically told, nope, one piece of land, one government, your problem. So across these countries, that's kind of what history left you with. Those processes of disruption and rigidification. Well, of course, then we start to get the revolution, the rights revolution in some places, not everywhere. It hasn't happened yet in some of these places. But you begin to get the court decisions here in Canada. You get things like the Self-Determination Act in the United States, which I'm not convinced the US government really understood when they called it self-determination. But a lot of Indigenous peoples realized what that meant and decided we're going to act on our understanding of that term. And as Indigenous peoples began to reassert those rights, and we have to acknowledge how it was the activism of the 60s and 70s. It was the battles going way back in my country to the 1920s, and the effort by the Pueblo peoples to stop the taking of their lands. It's a long history for you, for Indigenous people in the United States and others. And what it gets to eventually is where we are today, which is the ability to exercise real power. And when that happens, given this history of disruption, of what you've been through, certain questions emerge. And 2 of them strike me as very important, and they reflect this kind of conflict that we now have between the organizational results of colonialism, what they left you with in terms of who you are, who we think you are, the conflict between that and between who you believe you are or who you want to be. There's a very eminent Maori leader in New Zealand, knighted by the Crown. Sir Tipene O'Regan is his name. His eminence comes partly because he was a major architect of one of the first 2 major settlements between a Maori people, an iwi, translated as tribe, and the Crown. And his iwi is the Ngāi Tahu people of the South Island of New Zealand. And O'Regan, he gave a lecture a year and a half ago in Australia that I thought was a fascinating piece of strategic thinking about the future. And he said the fundamental question we face is, what do we want to be as a people? That's what we have to decide before we decide how to govern. Before we decide any of those things, we have to decide what and who do we want to be. 50 years down the track, 7 generations down the track, whatever the frame of reference is that you find most congenial, what do you imagine being as a nation, as a people? Because only when you can answer that question can you then decide, all right, now we've got to think about what governance tools we need to get there. Now we can think seriously about what it's going to take to get from here, our starting point, to that vision. Well, in the process, you've got to deal with the organizational consequences of colonialism. And it strikes me that there are 2 critical questions that come out of that. And one of them is, I think of it in these terms, who's the collective self in self-determination and self-government? Who is the nation going to be? Is it going to be the Wet'suwet'en Nation reconstituting itself as one nation, or is it going to be 4 First Nations? Who's the collective self in Wet'suwet'en self-determination and self-government? So that's one of the questions that you have to think through, and it's part of who do we want to be as a people. And then the second one is, how should we govern? Once you've answered those questions, who do we want to be? What do we want to be? And who is the collective self in self-government and self-determination? Then let's grapple with the concrete stuff of how do we do it. So the result of answering those questions turns out to be diversity. And I think I said yesterday, to central government, diversity is a problem. I think our research shows diversity is a solution. The problem arises when you try to force Indigenous peoples into a single template when it comes to governance, because they aren't the same people. We've come up with this term, Indigenous, Aboriginal, Native, whatever that is, but it's a leveler. It doesn't begin to capture what you're dealing with on the ground. So I think that nations are answering these questions differently in different places. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on the first one, although I will say a little bit about it. I'm going to spend a little more time on the second one. But question one, who is the collective self? Now, as I said, I think actually you are the ones, as I look around the world, and I think also in Australia, this is a critical question because of even more devastating consequences of colonialism. And when we get to Australia, I'll mention why I say that. But I think you're the ones who are already dealing with this. You heard this in Sophie Pierre and Catherine Denise yesterday. You heard it in the references to Clicho. We've heard it in a lot of the conversation this morning. Where is the boundary around us? Who are we? I remember Sophie Pierre once saying she sits on the board of our Native Nations Institute and talking about, we're Kootenai, we're Ktunaxa, we're one people. Why would we organize any other way? So we are. So many of you know you're either wrestling with that issue yourselves or you're dealing with it, seeing it being dealt with by others. In the United States, this tends not to be, for many peoples, most Indigenous peoples, not to be that big of a problem because of the treaty process and because of the way it dealt with these issues. So we don't find a lot of nations today that are kind of wondering, where do we put the boundary? It's got a lot of historical weight behind it. There's what sociologists call path dependence there. But there are some cases, and I think the most interesting ones, well, and we do see, I mentioned there was consolidation. Well, the Yakima today aren't trying to move back to 14 tribes and bands. No, they've concluded, you know what, we're the Yakima. We became one people in a treaty in 1855. It was someone else's idea, but that's now a century and a half ago. We are the Yakima people, and that is how we're going to act and organize. So some of those issues have been resolved. We have some interesting border issues in the United States, and some of them are cross-border issues with Canada and some cross-border issues with others. One of them is the Gwich'in. This is a Canadian issue, the Gwich'in Nation, the Gwich'in people in the interior of Alaska, Yukon, Northwest Territories, dispersed among these communities. Today, they're trying to say, you know, we're one people. Can we not begin to organize? That international boundary wasn't our idea. It cut right through the middle of our people, of our culture, of our relationship to the land. They've not gotten that far organizationally, but to me, they're talking about the right things. They're saying, who do we want to be? Where is that boundary going to be? That's a long-term project to try to negotiate across that international boundary, made even longer term by the events of 9/11, where that boundary now has a degree of attention it wasn't getting before. But that vision of being one nation and bringing together communities from Old Crow to Venati and Arctic Village and others is an extraordinary vision, an ambitious vision. And it reminds me of another conversation with Sophie Pierre once where she said, well, you know, one day we hope that those Ktunaxa people south of that international boundary in the United States will be part of the Ktunaxa nation, not just as a reality in culture and identity, but as a political reality. Those are ambitious visions, but why not? You know, 30 years ago, nobody thought some of the stuff you've done would happen. So why not dream that dream? We've got the Tohono O'odham Nation, which is right near where I live in Tucson, Arizona. You can see that's the U.S.-Mexico border on the slant there at the bottom of that map. And the city of Tucson, that distance from Tucson to Sells is something like, I don't know, close to 80 miles. It's a very large nation in terms of land base. But again, an international boundary was cut right through the middle of their people, and the result is that they have several thousand O'odham citizens who, to the O'odham people, are O'odham citizens. To the United States, they're Mexicans. And there was a time before that boundary became so politicized and militarized when O'odham moved pretty freely across that boundary. And health services in the town of Sells, which is the capital of the Tohono O'odham Nation, it's a nation of multiple communities in the desert there, but Sells is its capital. And they could access health services at Sells even though they weren't, in the United States view, citizens of the United States. But in the O'odham view, they're citizens of the Tohono O'odham Nation. Today, as you may be aware, we have politicians determined to build a wall along that boundary. Well, the O'odham have resisted that idea since it first came up in the aftermath of 9/11 and said, no, you're not putting a wall. It was enough that you put the boundary in there. Now you want to put a wall? Their battle is, how do we get the United States to treat those 3,000 or so O'odham citizens who live in Mexico as part of our nation? So these are some of the sort of who's the collective self issues that are rising in the United States, and some of them have these boundary aspects which make them extremely difficult. Let's look at Australia, and I think this is an interesting case. We had some Indigenous Australians come to the United States about 7 or 8 years ago. They were interested in looking at Indigenous governance issues in North America, and we took them to 3 nations in the U.S. We took them to the Navajo Nation, the Hopi Nation, and to one of the New Mexico pueblos that I'll mention a little later on. And then we brought them up here, and with help from Neil Starrett and others, we were able to take them to Gitxsan, to one of the Gitxsan communities, to Gitignan, and eventually up to Nisga'a, where they were wonderfully received by the Nisga'a Nation in the council chambers of that nation. And some of the story that we heard from Kevin McKay this morning was given to them as the story of the Nisga'a Nation renaissance and governance. At the end of this time they spent in the United States, we had a debriefing in Tucson before they flew back to Australia, and I said to them that most of the debriefing was about what they felt they'd learned from these experiences of visiting your peoples and peoples in the U.S. to talk about governance. And I said, if we brought some Indigenous leaders from North America to Australia, what do you think they would learn from you? And the most interesting answer was a woman who said, I think they learn what's possible under even more hostile conditions. In Australia, there's no fundamental recognition of Indigenous peoples as political entities. There's something called native title, which recognizes a certain quality of title to land, but it's not a recognition that you as an Indigenous community have a right to govern in a fundamental sense. You can engage in what I think of as corporate or organizational government. We'll show you how to run a meeting and how to do a little budgeting and things like that. But lawmaking, dispute resolution, those kinds of things, not on the table. So what you end up with is peoples with a very substantial governing challenge that I'll talk about in a minute, but you also see in Australia the aftermath of colonialism in this dispersal of indigenous people off of their country into cities, into service centers. And they face this issue of who is the collective self in some interesting ways. This is the Noongar Nation. That map up on the right, it's the southwest corner of Australia, down near Perth. But it's a very large area. Australia is approximately the size of the United States, excluding Alaska. So that's the sort of dimensions you're talking about, east, west, north, south. So it's a large area down there in southwest Australia. And the Noongar Nation is a bunch of dispersed communities in that region with, as I understand it, no substantial history of ever acting together politically. And yet they had land claims, and they had multiple land claims. And Australia was dealing with those claims one at a time, and Noongar realized we need to consolidate those claims and begin to act like a nation, not like multiple isolated communities, because we are, after all, one people. We share culture, language. We share an extraordinary history. So they've consolidated their claims, and in the process, what happened was a kind of a nation-making, a nation rebuilding, not in an organizational sense yet, although there are pieces of that in place, but in the sense of this is who we are, recreating in the head that identity which is the fundamental building block of nationhood. Who do we think we are? That's what a nation, being a nation, is about. And that process of consolidating claims moved that effect forward. And today, they were among the first in Australia to even use the language of nationhood, which is a very unusual language in Australia. And you see the Australian government sort of saying, wait a minute, what do they mean they're nations? Well, finally, the Social Justice Commissioner in Australia last year, who's an Aboriginal man himself, said, I like this language of nationhood. I like the fact that I'm beginning to hear it, and it's coming from communities, not from us. It's Aboriginal people saying, we'll tell you who we are. Just listen. This is up in northern Australia, what they call the top end. It's a tropical part of Australia, just west of Darwin. The Australian government, in pulling people off their country and putting them in service centers, crushed cultures and languages together. So in the area around what's called Port Keats or Wadeye, there are more than 20 different language groups, mutually unintelligible languages, brought together into a single social service center or town. The land they're on belongs to only one of them. It's only one community's traditional land. But they have had to figure out, how do we become one entity? They can't go back to their traditional country. So they're facing the issue of multi-community governance at a very difficult level, trying to build relationships across language, across culture, across attachment to land. And yet they're doing it. They developed this thing called the Tamara Regional Council. It didn't last. It ended up in difficulty, but it was the beginning of something, of this attempt by people who say, okay, we are carriers of this horrendous legacy of colonialism, but we will figure out how to deal with it, and are trying to do so. Multi-community governance of the toughest kind. I said I'd mention a couple of places outside the Kansas countries. This is Belize, Central America, down there bordering Guatemala and part of Mexico. It's a small Central American country. In the southeast of the country, the indigenous population is Maya. And oil and gas have been discovered on Maya lands in the southeast. The Maya are divided into more than 35 villages. Those villages each have their own governing system with an alcalde, the head person of the village. And when oil and gas were developed there, Belize moved forward to develop those oil and gas resources, and the Maya protested and said, no, that's our land. You can't just march in here and develop those resources. And they went to court, and my colleague Jim Anaya, who spent 6 years as UN Special Rapporteur on Indigenous Issues and is a professor of law at the University of Arizona. Jim was one of the lead litigators on this case for the Maya, and in 2007, they won in the Supreme Court of Belize, and the Supreme Court affirmed Maya rights to control what happened on their lands, and they had a huge celebration there in Belize, and Jim told me that they had this celebration, and one of the leaders of the Maya effort came up to him and said, "Jim, we won! We won! Now what?" That's the question. What do you do the day after the court decision comes down? What do you do the day after the treaty's signed? What do you do the day after the settlement? And what the Maya face today is more than 35 villages with no history of united political action outside of this court case, but they've just had a set of rights affirmed. That was 2007. Of course, this got appealed. And last year, the final appeal was won in the Caribbean Court of Justice. So it's been resolved. But now what the Maya face is, okay, who and what do we want to be? The door's open. Now we've got to fill it with our vision of the future. What is it? And you have to do this while other interests are saying, okay, they've got that right, but we can go village to village and say, hey, we'll make a deal with you. We'll make a deal with you. Oh, you look like we can make a deal with you. And the next thing you know, you've lost that opportunity to say, we know who we are, and we're going to act together and take advantage of this because someone else undermines it. That's the challenge they face right now as we speak, is who are we going to be and how do we make that happen? Now, the stories I've told you so far are almost all of people's moving to larger structures, and there's an obvious logic to that. There's a political logic to that, the power that comes from scale. You know, in Southern California, we have a lot of very small First Nations. Some of them, I did some work with one that has 14 adult citizens, or did at the time that they asked me to come and talk with them about nation building. Well, you may have a little land and 14 citizens and moral authority and even some legal rights on your side, but it's going to be a tough road to negotiate with those outside powers. So, of course, a lot of what we're seeing as people rethink this, who's the collective self, a lot of what we're seeing is, I think my watch just said, hurry. What we're seeing is people moving to larger scales. And so, but not everyone is doing that. So in the United States, for example, the White Earth Nation, which is an Anishinaabe people in the state of Minnesota, they're currently breaking away from the Minnesota Chippewa tribe, which is an organization of 5 First Nations, and trying to establish their own constitution and government. And they went actually through a constitutional process that was adopted. It was done very well, completely engaging the community. They succeeded. The Constitution was passed with more than 80% of the vote. And then the Minnesota Chippewa tribe said, wait a minute, you can't do that quite so easily. So it's still being worked out. But the issue is the same. Who do we want to be? What's the collective self and self-determination and self-government? So where are these kinds of things coming from? Well, we're seeing these reassertions of identity, identities that were savaged by colonialism. That's the Atum case, Gwich'in, Ktunaxa, Ngarrindjeri, a group I haven't talked about yet in South Australia. More effective pursuit of land claims, that's the Noongar case. Newly recognized rights or assets, that's the Maya. Scale and capacity considerations, Tamara, the Grand Council of the Crees would be an example right here in Canada where that's important. Crisis, again, the Grand Council of the Crees and the hydropower challenge that they faced, and that necessity of we've got to act with power, that means we've got to act together, and the result is the Grand Council of the Crees. So we're seeing a number of things that are driving this sort of change. But I want to switch to this second question, which I think in some ways is perhaps the one closer to what you all are thinking about and maybe where there's some useful material. So let's go back to the United States on this question of how do we govern? And I think again, I go back to this statement that we're seeing diversity out there. We're seeing a flurry of constitution making. All the issues that you've been talking about the last 2 days around constitutions, I'm hearing all the time in the United States now. Osage, completing constitutional reform. Cherokee, completing constitutional reform. Isleta del Sur, all these different communities that are going through this process or have been through this process recently of rethinking the governing system and reclaiming their right to design government for themselves in response to their values, their ideas about what works, their dreams, not Washington's, not someone else's. So we're seeing some interesting things emerge. Some of these are very old systems that are still alive. Some are not. This is Confederated Salish and Kootenai tribes of the Flathead, who I've already mentioned. 1855, the U.S. put them all on a single piece of land, a reservation in Montana. When they decided we got to rethink our governing system, the real question was, well, wait a minute, whose traditions do we follow? They're not all the same. Should it be Salish? Should it be Kootenai? And furthermore, they realized one of the three populations, they didn't really have a choice of whether to stay together. That was what they were stuck with. But they realized one of the three populations is larger than the other two. If we have a general election for chair, as chiefs are often called in U.S. reservations and tribal communities, if we have a general election for chair, the largest population, it's always going to be from that population. So the heck with that, we'll go parliamentary style. So they elect representatives from districts across the res, and then the district representatives, that council, chooses the chair. Just a thoughtful piece of governance machinery that says, okay, we've got this burden, this legacy of colonialism. It could have unfortunate effects that end up alienating some people from their own government. Let's think how we deal with it. So you move to a parliamentary system that deals with the problem. And today, this governing system of theirs, one of them said to us, we couldn't do anybody's first choice. The Kootenays didn't want it to be a Salish government. The Salish didn't really want a Kootenai government. So we decided, well, it'll be everybody's second choice. It looks a lot like kind of good old U.S. governing institutions. So they've got an independent court system and this parliamentary system. The U.S. isn't parliamentary, but you get the idea. Pueblo of Laguna in New Mexico, 6 villages, each with representation on a council. These officials are described as elected, but in fact, when you look at what happens in these villages, there aren't any elections, not in the sense of people running against each other. No, the older people in these villages tend to look for younger people of promise and accomplishment and integrity and cultural understanding, and they decide, and they say, you're going to run for the council. And then everyone knows who's running, and when the election comes, no one runs against them. And they tend to be people in their 30s. The council is looked over by older Laguna citizens, but the leadership tends to be young people, 30s and 40s, who've been chosen by their villages because they showed the qualities that were necessary. And we talked to one of these, a young man in his 30s, and he said, the day they came to me and said, you're the one, he said, that was a sobering day. I realized, now the weight of the future of this place is on me. He said, they're not giving you power. They're watching you. They're giving you responsibility, and the question is, can you deliver? That's a great way to pick politicians. Sometimes wish we did it that way. Coche de Pueblo, another of the rather traditional pueblos in New Mexico. They have no written constitution. They have no elections. They have no written legal code. They govern themselves in a system that has very ancient roots. They're Spanish influences because that part of the United States was first colonized by Spain, then by Mexico, now the United States. But 6 officers are chosen by the senior spiritual leader each year, December 29th, so I'm told. And that, the cacique, you can hear the Spanish language influence, the cacique appoints the 6 individuals who will run the place for the next year. There's a governor and a lieutenant governor. There's a war captain and lieutenant war captain. They separate the secular and the spiritual sides of things. There are 2 other positions. Anyone who's ever appointed to one of these 6 positions is a member of the council for life. It's called the Council of Principales. And what that means is that if you're appointed governor, you've got at your fingertips in that council all the accumulated wisdom and experience of everyone who's still alive who has ever served as governor. They're available to say to you, no, 15 years ago when we did that, here's what we were thinking. I was there. What an asset to a decision maker. And to the outside, when we arrived there, this was one of the cases in the early sample of the Harvard project. When we arrived there, we had heard Cochiti Pueblo's doing really interesting stuff economically. So we said, let's go talk to Cochiti. We arrive at Cochiti and we say, we'd like to talk to somebody. We'd arranged this beforehand. They said, oh, well, you need to go to the governor's office. Well, that's what we expected. The governor must be the top person here. So we go to the governor's office and we had a very interesting conversation, but felt we didn't really quite get to the nub of Cochiti governance. And it wasn't until much later, after we had talked with some Cochiti people for a long time over several visits, that someone finally said, let me tell you what the story is here. The governor is not the top person. It's the war captain. Because the war captain is responsible, and I'll never forget the words this one man used. He said, for all the things we cherish. Our culture, ceremony. That's the war captain's responsibility, is to sustain the ceremonial cycle and the culture of the people. And the governor's job is to protect the war captain from the world out there, from the United States, from the state of New Mexico, from the school system, from the 2 guys from Harvard who just showed up asking all these questions. That's the governor's job, to protect the war captain who's responsible for all the things we cherish. Interesting system. And Cochiti Pueblo today is an economic success. It runs profitable enterprises, and it does it with a governing system that looks nothing like what I learned government was about when I was in school. Citizen Potawatomi Nation, more than 25,000 citizens concentrated in the state of Oklahoma. These are Potawatomi who began up in Michigan and Wisconsin, that area, were forced by the United States to move several times, ended up in Oklahoma on very few acres of land. At one time, back in the early 1970s, this nation had about 12 acres of land to which it had possession. Their population dispersed. They have big Potawatomi populations in LA, Denver, etc. But they revised their constitution in 2007, and one of the things they were concerned about was they said, we don't want to lose our citizens who've moved away. So they did an interesting thing. They divided the United States into districts, the entire country into districts, and they created a 16-member legislature, and half of those seats have to be filled by Potawatomis close to home, and the other half can be filled by a Potawatomi anywhere in the United States, and they hold their council meetings through video conferencing. The video screen you see there's got the councilor from the district that includes Los Angeles up there engaging live in the debate over the legislation in front of the council, voting on the debate. This is their map of the U.S. Oklahoma there in the center, which is home to where half the legislators come from, and the other districts each have a seat on the council. So if you're a citizen Potawatomi citizen, anywhere in the United States, you potentially have a voice in Potawatomi affairs through that governing system. And we've heard a number of nations in recent years talking about how do we incorporate our non-native citizens. And I was interested this morning in the urban locals in that presentation because this is how one nation has responded to that challenge. very thoughtfully. They also make all their social services available to any Potawatomi anywhere in the United States. If you're a citizen of the nation, you can get a small business loan from the nation. You can tap into their healthcare system. You can tap into all the social services they offer. Rocky Barrett, the chairman of the nation, says, our goal is that if you're a citizen of the Potawatomi Nation, you recognize this is your home, and what we do for Potawatomi citizens, we do for you because you're one of us. Creating a sense of nationhood among people who may be 1,000 miles from home. In Australia, in terms of governing systems, this is the Ngarrindjeri Nation in South Australia. The Ngarrindjeri are divided into a number of, never been quite sure what to call them, but they're clan-like elements called Lakanlinyeri. And traditionally, each of those had a governing body called a Tendi that was overseen by a senior figure called a Rupali. Well, Ngarrindjeri, as it reclaims governing power over its land and over its people, is restoring some of those relationships and recreating some of that older governing system, and doing so despite the fact that Australia doesn't really grant it. Until very recently, the state of South Australia has begun to support this sort of thing, but for the whole beginning of this system, it really wasn't given by Australia the kind of legitimacy as a political body that it deserved. So they're one of the examples of trying to come up with strategies that work under more hostile conditions. The West Central Arnhem Regional Authority was an attempt by several communities, despite language and cultural differences, to work together because Australia had made clear that's the only way you can do it. You're going to have to figure out how to work together. So they confronted cultural differences and other things and said we can put this together. They created a West Central Arnhem Regional Authority, and then Australia changed its policy, pulled the rug out from under them, and it came apart. The Gunditjmara Nation in Australia, this is in Victoria. I love that flag. They do an interesting thing. They do something I call stealth governance. Because Australia tells Indigenous nations how you have to organize. If you want to organize to receive funds or to take advantage of native title, here's how you have to do it. And Gunditjmara basically has said, okay, we'll do everything that you said, we'll comply at every point, but behind that facade of compliance, they stick to their old decision-making. We sat down the head of the Gunditjmering Traditional Owners Aboriginal Corporation, which really holds the title to land. We said to the president of the corporation, what's your job? He said, oh, I wait until the full group meeting, which is the sort of colloquial term they use for their traditional, the system that they're using that comes from older patterns. He said, I wait till the full group meeting makes a decision, then I type it up on letterhead from the Gunditjmering Corporation, and I sign it as president, and we submit it. It's all done according to how they say we should do it, except the actual decision, which is made according to the old system. Well, we call that stealth governance. You got to get creative in these circumstances. So in the shadows, behind the facade, you do it the way you think you have to do it, the way you think you should do it, and then you comply. The Maori people in New Zealand, divided into multiple tribes, but all speaking the same language with some dialectal differences, but basically mutually understood language, have doing a number of things. The Tainui people in the North Island, a large tribe, about 52,000 citizens, divided into 33 sub-tribes called Hapu, 68 Marae, which are actual, in many cases, family-based, but separate communities or family groupings. And they've created a parliament in which each marae has representation. And there's an executive board elected from that parliament to make decisions between the sittings of the parliament. So pretty standard, in some ways, looks very much like systems familiar to in our countries. And then you may not want to share an entire government, perhaps you only need to share parts of it. And here the best example I know is something that's happening in the United States As some of you are probably aware, in the United States, part of the rights regime that indigenous nations can build on in the U.S. is the right to their own court systems. And I was very interested this morning in hearing about these judiciary panels and the effort to create a judiciary that Dave Joe talked about. You know, to me, in the process of nation building, nation rebuilding, that ability to provide your own people with justice and public safety, that's a fundamental piece of governance. And I appreciate the fact that I gather from the presentations this morning, it's not something that Canada, British Columbia, or the Yukon really want you doing. But to me, it's fundamental. And I think it's an enormous advantage that indigenous nations in the U.S. have, that they can create tribal courts. And some of them have substantial, not only civil jurisdiction, but criminal jurisdiction of a much more limited kind, but some criminal jurisdiction as well. But one of the things that has happened, of course, is we have a number of very small nations. And so how do you, if you have 200 citizens, how do you create a court system? Who do you draw on? Where's the capital, human capital pool? And so what we're seeing is intertribal courts, where we have nations that are saying, okay, there's a piece of governance that we think is essential, but we can't deliver it ourselves, but we can deliver it in partnership with other nations. In the state of Montana, the 7 American Indian nations in Montana, for a time, I'm not sure it's still working, it's something I need to find out, but for a time there was an intertribal court in Montana, and there were 7 judges, one from each of those nations, and if a case came to that, it was the appeals court, actually. So you had, for example, the court of the Apsalika Nation, the Crow Nation in Montana, but if a case was appealed from that court, where did it go? It went to the Intertribal Appeals Court of Montana. And the Crow judge excused himself or herself from that case, so the other 6 judges passed on it. And it was an effort to say we've got to have non-political dispute resolution. You've got to get the politics out of dispute resolution if you want that trust that was talked about this morning. If you want to create that trust in your own citizens and in outsiders, then you've got to be sure you have a court system that delivers on the merits of the case, not on who you voted for, who your relatives are, any of that sort of stuff. And that Montana Intertribal Appeals Court solved it. Took the politics out of it, had great trust. We've seen a couple of other cases. This is the Northwest Intertribal Court System. Tribes in western Washington, where we have a lot of very small tribes, in 1979, figuring out how do we address our justice needs? And realizing they were going to have to work together, and they created the Northwest Intertribal Court System. And that system supplies judges and other personnel. It's a personnel bank, basically. Offers all these services to nations that can't produce it for themselves, but each court located on its respective reservation has its own laws, but has a shared judicial system. Another example, the Intertribal Court of Southern California, 12 nations in San Diego County, where their nations are very small. And here the court actually serves as a sitting court. It's not a personnel bank, it's a court that each nation has said we will defer to the decisions of that court. And it is an indigenous court. So essentially they're saying, okay, we trust this court, it understands us, we will go with it. So I think what we're seeing is changing governmental forms over time. Pre-invasion, what did we have? You had self-determination. That's what you had, pre-invasion. And if you see that stack of blocks as multiple nations, you would have seen different governing systems. The Lakota system would have been different from the Tsimshian system. So we had multiple forms of governance under conditions of freedom. And then what happened is in all the Kansas countries, we got the good old one-size-fits-all, the imposition of colonialism, and a change toward common forms. Got to do it by the Indian Act, got to do it by the Indian Reorganization Act, have to do it under the ORIC, whatever it is, Office of the Registrar of Indigenous Corporations in Australia, etc. And now with the power revolution that's going on, self-determination is returning with some constraints, but what we're seeing is the return to multiple forms as you have the opportunity to say, We know how we want to govern, and this is how we're going to do it. I think in some ways you're reclaiming history, not by going backwards, but by writing the history that you're making. Thanks very much for the opportunity to talk with you.